I just want to check in to
Yep.
see if John Paul, if he can hear me. I know that he's on. I can see that he's muted,
hmm
but there he
Yep.
is.
I can hear you. Not sure if I'm revved up, but still ready to present. So,
You're revved up for an auditor. That's good enough.
yeah, fair enough.
That's above the below. So, all right. Good morning, John Paul. If you want to introduce yourself to the members, and then we can get started.
Sure. And I'm also sharing my screen if you're able to see that. Again, my name is John Paul Lechevalier with Clifton Larson Allen, or CLA. We're the external financial statement auditors and have been for a number of years at this point. So I'm going to be presenting the results of the annual comprehensive financial report, or the ACFR, as well as the single audit, which is included at the end of the ACFR file itself. And so just to kind of kick things off, if you've been on the Finance and Audit Committee or seen the board presentation, you're going to be familiar with this. So, but just wanted to briefly kind of cover what we're responsible for under generally accepted auditing standards. Basically, what we're responsible for is reviewing the financial information that the district has presented, making sure that it's without material misstatement or error, that all the required disclosures are included, and that the financial statements are set up the way that it should be. I've used this example before, but essentially the district is the author of the financial statements, and we would be the editor, double checking to make sure that everything's presented the way that it should, that all of the amounts are included the way that they should be. Couple of key things in here is that we do consider the internal controls, and that's a pretty significant part of our audit procedures, making sure that that structure is in place in a way that would lead to those financial results being presented accurately. But we're not specifically issuing an opinion over the effectiveness of those internal controls. We do review to see that if there's any potential misstatements due to fraud, but that's not a significant focus of the audit. So if we were specifically reviewing for fraud, there'd be a very different set of audit procedures that we would be performing. And then we're looking for reasonable but not absolute assurance. So basically, we didn't review absolutely every transaction that the district had. Again, it was focused on those internal controls, statistical sampling, kind of other methodologies to make sure that the amounts are reasonably presented as materially correct. One other thing that I wanted to point out is that our audit really is focused on making sure that what's presented is accurate. What we don't issue our opinion on is whether that's necessarily good or bad. In fact, really the only baseline that we have for the audit is, in terms of whether something's good or bad, is just if there's an ability for the district to continue for the reasonable foreseeable future, generally a year or more into the future, which is obviously a very low bar and something that I don't think anyone has concerns with the district shutting down within the next 12 months. So it's a pretty low bar that we're looking at in terms of kind of performance, yes or no. Really what we are looking to do is make sure that the information is accurate. That way the board, as well as the bond rating agencies, citizens, et cetera, any kind of stakeholders for the district are able to rely on the financial information as being accurate. Okay, so with that out of the way, kind of moving into the scope of the audit. So first we have the financial statement audit, which takes up the vast majority of the ACFR, the pages of the ACFR. I'm pleased to be able to say that we did issue what is referred to as an unmodified opinion, also informally referred to as a clean audit opinion. And so what that means is, if we go back to what the purpose and scope of the audit was, if that's making sure that everything's materially correct, our opinion is stating that after all of our audit procedures, we do believe that the financial statements are materially correct, that there's nothing in there that we believe is out of line with the way that it should be. Um, And so we'll go a couple slides on some charts to look at some broad strokes of how the financial statements shake out compared to previous years. But overall, unless there's any questions, comments, or kind of discussion that anyone on the committee would like to have relating to the financial information, it's going to be pretty light on that. I saw some of the things that were, it looks like there's a discussion later on in the agenda relating to fund balance. So we do have a couple of slides looking at that, which maybe will give a little bit of a framework for kind of that future discussion. In terms of the single audit, that's the required audit required by the federal government to review the different federal awards. This is something that the district has every single year, and it's required for any entity receiving over $1 million in federal awards. So the district received during fiscal year 2024, little less than 50 million in federal awards, so that was required. We're pleased to be able to say that we did not have any findings as part of the single audit, which is truly a feat to be able to do. There's a lot of audit procedures specifically designed around looking at the single audit. It's very black and white from a statistical sampling methodology. And so that's looking, we'll select a random sample based on the guidance that the federal government provides. And if something is off or doesn't have the internal controls, the approvals, things like that, that it needs to, even if it was, a $3 transaction that got sampled, that shows as a finding within the single audit section. So that's very black and white. It's less on that kind of materiality that the financial statement audit has. This is much more yes or no in terms of the single audit. So we'll cover that in just a little bit more detail as well. And then in terms of findings and recommendations, we did not have any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. Those would be included within the audit report, within the actual PDF, if there were any of those. So we're pleased to be able to say that there were not any. We did have a couple of IT recommendations, all of those being really more best practice recommendations, so nothing reaching that level of significance for a material weakness or a significant deficiency. Okay, so like I mentioned, we'll move a couple slides on some charts with the financial results. This first one, and I'll try not to get too much into the details of governmental accounting, which covers school districts, but the district's net position, which would be the district's equity, so basically assets minus liabilities, that net position includes the long-term items such as capital assets like the school buildings. It also includes the net pension liability relating to para, and also includes the district's bonds and other long-term liabilities. So if we look here, you can see that the chart is upside down because the district's net position is negative and has been for the last 5+ years. We'll see in a moment, and if you've looked at the financial statements recently, you probably remember this is due to the net pension liability that's required to be presented for the district. So if we look here, kind of the 10-year graph of kind of the net pension liability and what's been presented. If we look for fiscal year 2024, the net pension liability was just a little less than 800 million compared to the negative net position that's a little over negative 100 million. So really that would be a positive number except for the net pension liability. That net pension liability, if you remember, is basically the actuarially calculated liability going out into the future of how much the deficit that para has relating to the school division trust fund. This is not a liability that's going to be due anytime soon. It's not something that the district could pay off, even if you did have $800 million sitting around that you wanted to give to para. So it's really kind of more of a very long-term focused liability, basically saying that without additional contributions either by the state or by the district, or adjustments to the benefits provided to retirees, or kind of other factors that the pension fund is not going to last without some of those changes. Again, nothing. Para does an analysis looking out the next 30 years, so they don't believe that there's going to be any issues in the next 30 years. But if you extend it out basically into perpetuity, that they do believe that this would eventually run out and need to be adjusted. So kind of the longer-winded explanation of the net pension liability, but that's why the net position is shown as a negative amount, and you'll notice the significant pension liability on the district's financial statements. Much less significant, but also relating to para, is the net OPEB liability. OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. Para provides a healthcare premium subsidy that's part of the benefits provided to retirees. That's considered, really, most people would look at it as part of the pension plan, but under accounting standards, it is viewed separately, and so that does get presented on a separate line. The amount is, for fiscal year 2024, a little less than $20 million, so not anywhere close to as significant as the net pension liability, but because most people don't throw around the word OPEB all the time, I have a slide on it here just so that if you're looking at the financial statements, you know what that includes. Looking at the fund balance, here you can see that fund balance in fiscal year 2024 did increase from the previous couple of years. And so the fund balance would be the equity. So again, assets minus liabilities, but this is on a current basis, basically similar to the basis that you would budget for. So that excludes buildings, bonds, that net pension liability. Those items would not be included within the assets and liabilities. Obviously, like the principal payments that are due on the bonds, those would be included as expenditures. If there's payments for construction, renovation, those types of things, those are included as expenditures, which would be reducing this fund balance. And so if you see the two different colors, the darker shade is the fund balance excluding the building fund, which is the kind of lighter greener shade. That building fund is almost entirely bond proceeds. And so if you see in fiscal year 2020 that there's a decrease to fiscal year 2021 in the fund balance, but that's really relating to that green part of the shading decreasing, which would be a spending down of the bond proceeds, which would be, required to be spent within a couple of years after issuance, and really would be an expected decrease. So the darker shade showing that that's gradually increasing would be showing that excluding those bond proceeds, there is a gradual strengthening of the district's overall financial position, at least from an absolute dollar perspective, over the last 5 years. So one other thing that I did want to show, which I think is maybe a little interesting, is the fund balance as a percentage of expenditures. So if you were to consider the remaining fund balance, again, that's assets minus liabilities, compared to expenditures as a percentage. And for this chart, I'm excluding the building fund as well as capital outlays. So if we kind of exclude those debt proceeds and any of the capital outlays that can go up or down each year, depending on what capital projects are ongoing, this would basically be showing how much of the expenditures for the fiscal year the district would be able to afford without having any additional revenue come in. So basically, if we look at this for fiscal year 2024, that would say that if in fiscal year 2025 expenditures were roughly the same amount, the district would be able to go almost halfway through the year before running out of funds without having any additional revenues. Obviously, that's not a situation that's going to happen. The district is going to be receiving revenues, but it's generally a good measure of kind of how much is being stored in reserves. And so that's going to be showing a stronger financial position. And sometimes, again, looking at just the dollars in fund balance can be kind of a hard gauge of, well, did your expenditures go up pretty significantly? Was there a change in the cost for salaries and benefits, things like that, that would really show that the district is in not as strong of a financial position. But again, this percentage might show, be an additional kind of piece of the puzzle when you're looking at assessing the district's financial position. So that's all of the information, kind of financial statement results wise. Any questions or comments before we get into the IT recommendations and the single audit results?
No questions for me.
All right,
None here,
sounds
Jeff.
good. Great. We'll continue on. Just making sure that I wasn't on mute for the last 10 minutes or whatnot. So
We heard you.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. I get it's most of this is good news and not anything overly concerning or anything like that. So understand that maybe there's not too much to ask questions or discuss. Okay, so looking at the IT recommendations. I did want to point out that there was a new auditing standard that was required to be implemented for fiscal year 2024. That auditing standard would change the required procedures that we have to go through. It's actually applicable not just to governments, but really every audit performed in the United States. And that increases the scope relating to IT systems. I will say that this is still a relatively shallow review. There's a lot that can be gone into for cybersecurity and disaster recovery and kind of all of that, in a lot more detail. But it is something that we were required to review a little bit more thoroughly than we have in the past. And so from that review, we did have some recommendations relating to IT policies, cybersecurity, testing of backups for the disaster recovery plan that the district has. So those were, again, just big picture, some of the things that we were discussing with them and had some recommendations. None of these were significant enough to show up in the communication for the audit results, either within the audit report or in our governance communication. So kind of the formal letter that goes to the board at the end of the audit. But it is something that we're bringing up just as, if the district staff mentions that they have some IT changes that they're making relating to audit recommendations, and you say, hey, I thought we didn't have any findings or whatnot, just an FYI that this was something that was discussed, but again, more of the best practice recommendation than an audit finding. Okay, so moving to the single audit results. Again, this is the audit over federal awards. The district received approximately $48.7 million in federal awards for fiscal year 2024. Major programs would be what programs we were specifically testing. So the federal government has kind of a rotating program over every 3 years that awards over a specified dollar amount and kind of threshold would be tested. And so for fiscal year 2024, we did look at the special education cluster or the IDEA program, as well as the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which was used by the district primarily to purchase a number of Chromebooks for students and faculty. So those were the two programs that we looked at. There's basically the federal government says almost exactly how they want these programs to be tested. And so with that, we follow all of the procedures that they lay out. And we're, again, pleased to be able to report that there were no findings or question costs. So basically no issues that were detected as a result of this single audit. Okay, so to wrap things up, again, I mentioned that there is a formal letter that's distributed to the board at the end of the audit. This slide and the next one just kind of summarizes the key points from that. If there is basically anything significant that came up during the audit, it would be reported in this letter, even if it doesn't show up directly within the audit report itself. So there were no significant changes in accounting policies or accounting estimates, no new governmental accounting standards that were required to be implemented. There were also no uncorrected or corrected misstatements. And so that would be, as we issue our audit report, we're saying that we believe that the financial statements are materially correct. But if during the audit process, we may have adjustments that need to be made based on our audit procedures, if we did have any of those that went into the financial statements to kind of get us to the point where we could issue that clean audit opinion, those would be listed here. But kudos to the district for not having any required adjustments to get to that clean audit opinion. And so really the clean audit opinion is something that most governments should be expecting to receive. A lot of them will have to go through a number of adjustments and find things that are corrected and during the audit process. But kudos again to the district for a very clean audit. So basically nothing being presented here means that everything that was presented to us was materially correct, and that all the district's records were in order and well organized when we received it. The last thing that I'll point out from this one is just that the district does have what we refer to as a group financial statement, which means that the charter schools within the district are included. Obviously, they have their own separate governing board and separate management, but they are included as part of what the district has oversight over. Those are presented within separate columns, so the charter schools would not be included in those graphs that we were looking at earlier, but you will see their financial information included within there. And so with that, again, kudos to the district for a very clean and smooth audit for this year. I'll open it up again if there's any questions, comments, or discussion items.
Hi, Jean-Paul. And Aaron, this is probably more of a question for you. With regard to the IT recommendations on cybersecurity and such, is there any concern or things to worry about budget-wise? Like, is it going to be a significant expenditure or anything like that?
So we'll go into probably executive session and talk a lot with the board in more detail. But what I would say is the biggest point of emphasis is going to be on policies and procedures and testing those procedures. So it isn't as if we're not doing a lot of these things. It's that we need to make sure that we're documenting the overall process and that we're following that process, where we continue to utilize, I would say, as best as possible, the top of the line defenses that we have. I call one of our folks, he sits in a dark room that I never get to see him. And he's the one, these guys are really doing a good job of fighting defenses. We will actually present this we actually did already present this to Moody's and S&P, and we'll present this to due diligence and bonds tomorrow. And in essence, I think, Kelly, to answer your question is no, don't believe that at the moment it's going to drastically change our budget. It will change the amount of time we need to spend on documenting processes, ensuring those processes align to kind of what we've been doing. We do things and then they're not always written down.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Appreciate the answer there, sir. Thank you.
And from our side, working with John Paul these years has been fantastic. We have been with CLA for quite some time. We have switched different signing. What would you call it, John Paul? The signing.
We use the word, engagement leader or audit leader, but partner, principal would be what most people would call it. Yeah.
And so what that allows us to do is ensure that we have continuity among the auditors, which is now more of the best practice that the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, has put out, that it's more likely that we should be staying with the audit firm and then switching partners or switching reviewers on somewhere around a 5-year basis. What I would also say is, maybe John Paul, can you touch on quickly the review process? So it isn't just you looking at it and you signing off as partner, but the quality control, quality assurance review that happens before this is signed off on. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So really the process that we go through, as much as I know some of the governments that we have, and kind of what Aaron just mentioned with the IT policies and procedures, is that it's never enough to just do something for the audit. You also have to document that it was done, and frequently have someone else double check that you documented that it was done. So it can feel kind of a redundant process, but that's to make sure that, if something is important, that it's actually being done and that it's being double checked. We take the same process for our audit work papers. And so that would be done by an individual within the audit team and then reviewed by myself. And then at the end of the audit, we have someone from another office that's unassociated with our group that kind of takes their independent review of our audit work papers, making sure that we did everything that we need to do. If there's any changes, there's no material accounts that we missed. There's no new accounting standards, things like that we overlooked. So they kind of do their double check as well.
Then, John Paul, can you talk about the peer review that's required to happen between kind of audit firms? I can't remember how many years, every many years.
3 years is required to be done. So basically everything just continues to be reviewed and then reviewed again. We also have an internal inspection process where another set of independent reviewers will select a sample of audits throughout the entire firm and review those, making sure that in every audit leader is selected at a minimum every 3 years during that process. And then there's a peer review. And so that's still internal at CLA. And then every 3 years, there's a peer review process where another firm will come in and review a sample of what CLA has done and make sure that everything meets those standards. So really, it's just review upon review upon review, but the intent is to make sure that things are being done as they should be in terms of the audit processes that we have.
Auditors need to be audited.
And then those auditors need to be audited as well.
Exactly. Somebody needs to get paid. So I do want to make sure everyone had a chance to ask any questions before we move forward. I want to thank John Paul for his work and his dedication. We always have something that always falls off the schedule of being a perfectly timed audit, and I think John Paul and I we're always trying to make things more efficient in our process, and so I look forward to the next one. So thank you, John Paul.
Thank you, John Paul, and congratulations to Adams 12 on the clean audit.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So now we're going to turn to sort of fun. Now we're going to turn into how do we pick our auditors and what is required by what's required by board and board policy. That is one of the first pieces. And then as we go through our general process, our purchasing process and our procurement process, we have rules that we have to follow around procurement process that are board policy driven, as well as statutory and regulatory requirements around purchasing and procurement. And then we have the requirement of the board to go through, as this policy states, the competitive bid process. And we'll talk about how that happens. And I'll turn this mostly over to Brenda, and we'll talk about the last time that we did go out for RFP, the length of the current contract with CLA, and then the requirements as we move forward under the policies. Brenda.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning. My name is Brenda McGee. I'm the Director of Supply Chain Management. I apologize for my creaky voice this morning. Hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. We did select CLA under an RFP back in 21. Per board policy, anything over $100,000 has to be formally solicited. So an RFP was run at that time to select a candidate to be our auditor. CLA was that candidate, so we have been under contract with them from the start of that RFP. So we are currently in the last year of the contract with CLA. The contract that we have now will be for work performed in June through October of 25. So in the fall, we will be looking at running a new solicitation for to select a new audit firm, potentially. It could be CLA. There's nothing that bars them based on policy from resubmitting a proposal to be our auditor, so they can be reselected. We have had them, as Aaron said, for an extended time, but we just have to competitively bid that. Adams 12 uses a website called BidNet to post all of our solicitations, and most of our vendors are familiar with that. We also have the ability to do what we call a courtesy email when we post those solicitations, that if we have firms that we know potentially could be interested in the solicitation, we can make sure that they are notified that the posting is out on BidNet. So we do try to get that out to all potential bidders. Sometimes auditors aren't necessarily tied to BidNet, so when we know that we have companies that potentially could bid, we try to do those courtesy emails to make sure that they are notified. So we'll be running that process in the fall, but currently we are under contract with CLA to perform our audit from June to October 25 of the FY 25 books. The amendments to the contract get a little confusing because the extension says that we're in this fiscal year, but we're actually auditing the previous year. So it gets a little crazy when you're trying to look at it and make sure that you're covered. So that's a little bit about how we go about selecting auditors and the fact that we do this every 5 years. And we also set them up with contracts based on Tabor and everything else. Our contract reads an award for 1 year with the potential of 4-year renewals. So that contract can be extended each year. It is not a guaranteed 5-year contract. So any questions for me on that process?
I'm just curious, what is your fiscal year? Is it a calendar year?
No, fiscal year goes July 1 to June 30.
Your state fiscal year, okay.
Yes, sir.
The best because we have the counties who are under the calendar fiscal year. We are under the same fiscal year as the state because the state forced us to be. And then we also have the federal fiscal year, which ends on September 30th and begins on October 1st of every year. So when we start looking at governmental funds and federal funds awards that John Paul talked about, we're on the federal fiscal year as far as knowing how much money we might receive. So it's really a strange mix, but certainly the district is on the same fiscal year as the state.
The procurement policy that dictates what we're going to do as far as when we have to bid is policy number 3320. So that gives us our rules for engagement, so to speak, on how we have to do the solicitation to select the vendor. Aaron, anything else that you can think of on this topic?
We just mention here as well that the auditors work for the board. Auditors don't work for me. They report to the board. They report out to the board, and the board ultimately would be the one who's approving the contract with the auditors. So we're certainly the ones making those recommendations and informing the board of what current best practices are. They don't report to me. They don't work for me. So it's always to have that relationship, and I think that relationship's been very good. As far as John Paul stated, I want to brag for just a second that having the clean opinion that we had this year, which meant not only was there a clean opinion on the overall financial statements, but also on the single audit, which is controls around the spending of federal awards. And if you ever want to fall asleep, you can read the OMB supplement that's required to be followed on the audit. And I can't remember how many pages it is, but it's pushing about 2,000 pages now at least. No, it's got to be more than that. And then the next piece that John Paul mentioned is we also have different levels of findings, but the last bit of findings would be just those shared with the board in a management letter. And those would be audit adjustments, whether those were immaterial, so the auditors passed on those adjustments, or they required us to make those adjustments, but they were not significant enough to be stated in the financial statements themselves. As we presented this to the board, Chris noted, I noted, John Paul had mentioned that it is not common to have that level of an audit. So I would say that I'm very glad that we were able to reach that standard. I have not been a part of an audit since 1993 that has really received that level of cleanness across the entire piece. And as Chris mentioned, neither is he. So we're very happy on the results overall of the audit. So that was me breaking my arm, patting myself on the back.
Well-deserved kudos. Brenda,
Aaron, you did it very gracefully, very graceful.
Thank you.
Brenda, I'm not sure if you have more to present, but I was just curious. Thank you for explaining the bid process. Have there been any RFPs this year, or do you anticipate any coming up outside of the auditors?
There's been a lot of RFPs, Kelly, because the bond passed. We were already being proactive with trying to get solicitations on the street for our major projects that were scheduled in the bond for summer of 2025. The biggest project being the replacement of Thornton High School. So we were being proactive and putting solicitations on the street to try and get architects, owners reps, CMGC, which is the construction part on those. And we probably have about 10 active solicitations right now on the street, most of those related to bond, with different things like parking lots and some interior door renovations. Like I said, the Thornton project is huge. So those are the major projects that we have going on right now, and those are all being handled through an RFP process. And like I said, I think there's about 10 of them right now.
Excellent. Sounds like you guys were prepped and ready.
We were trying to be very proactive, particularly with Thornton High School. We know that other school districts passed bonds as well. And so we're trying to get these out there and get contractors under contract before everybody else does. There's a small vendor pool for all of these different positions. And so trying to be proactive and get good contractors under contract and have our bond items maybe trump other bond items from schools that are out there as well. So was trying to be proactive and get to a pool of vendors and get them under contract because we know the work is going to be crazy in summer of 25.
And last question, are you getting good responses, like a lot of participation and bids, competitive bids?
We are. I have been pleasantly surprised. I think the 4 that I am currently running or trying to finish up, I have received anywhere from, I think the one I'm reviewing right now, I have 9 responses. So I definitely was pleasantly surprised with those and getting that information. We're getting good response. We get good turnouts at the site walkthroughs. So I think these contractors are looking to set up their work for the summer and get everything planned out. So yes, we are getting some good response. And again, that is done through BidNet. And we have reached out with that courtesy email that I mentioned to a few contractors. But let's say on the one that I'm working on right now, I have 9 responses, and I think my courtesy email only went to like 4. So they are checking those and they are being proactive and looking at BidNet and getting that information.
Excellent. Excellent. Glad to hear it.
And just a side note on BidNet, a contractor has to sign up for BidNet. It's free to sign up. If they want to do what's called a push notice, I think there is a slight fee for that, maybe $20-$30. I can't remember. But what that does is they select a commodity that they are part of, like the construction world. And I say commodity codes, that's relative to the procurement world, and most people don't know what commodity codes are. But they can select their commodity codes, and then when any agency that uses BidNet posts a bid out there that hits their commodity code, it sends them a push notice and says, hey, Adams 12 or maybe Boulder Valley or whomever has just posted a bid you may be interested in, go take a look. So I think the vendors are being more proactive as well. And like I said, I have been pleasantly surprised and hopeful to see these. My evaluation committees may not be so happy to see 9 solicitations that they have to review and score. But I think it's good for us and making sure that we're getting out there and getting that vendor pool that we need to utilize.
For sure. The more options you have, the better solicitations and opportunity you have for cost savings.
Absolutely. Any other questions for me relative to soliciting or the auditor's selection process or anything else?
Last thing, Brenda, just go Broncos.
You kind of noticed I was not wearing proper business attire.
Oh, I think it's very appropriate with the Sunday night game. I'm happy to see it.
Well, I have a site walkthrough later.
Sorry,
this
Thursday
evening.
night game. I said Sunday. I meant Thursday. Sorry.
I have a site walkthrough for another project at 11 today. So typically when I'm out in the schools and walking around the parking lots in the schools, I wear jeans. So I thought, hey, what the heck? I'm going to throw on the Broncos to go with it.
It's perfect.
All right, Aaron, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you, Brenda.
Now we get to turn to what I would say is both the end of the story and the beginning of the story, and that is fund balance. And so we have a little presentation here that I'll share. Let me get that pulled up. Slide. I always find being in Google for slideshows versus in PowerPoint. It's always hard for me to figure out how it always is supposed to work. So I will cheat and just bring it down into PowerPoint. Also share my screen here. And I would say that this is a relatively short presentation as far as the number of slides, but I think it can be also a bit of a robust conversation if there are questions. And I know, Mike, you had asked these questions last year, and so I think we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, and I want to make sure I'm covering those pieces that we want to talk about. So first, we want to just talk about overall just what is fund balance, the components, what are I think the overall benefits of fund balance, or the right amount or the desired levels, and we'll take a look at those things, most of which is anecdotal. What is fund balance? It is, since the beginning of the school district, the accumulation of operating surpluses. What's an operating surplus? It's the difference between revenues and expenditures. And that is just over time, how is the district done relative to actual? Remember, this is in this particular piece, this is actuals. If we talk about actual revenues versus actual expenditures. And then we also have the budgeted side, which is the budgeted level of revenues and the budgeted level of expenditures. So what is the overall amount that's left when we have revenues and expenditures? So from the beginning of the school district, so we're almost the 75th anniversary of the school district. So over the last 75 years, what has been the accumulation? If you added up all of the revenues of the school district in 75 years, added up all of the expenditures within 75 years, subtracted those two numbers, that is our fund balance, right? So I'm glad I don't have to do that because it just rolls year over year. So what then is the overall fund balance? It's what's left also after you think about all of our assets and all of our liabilities, what is left. And in this particular instance, when we talk about fund balance in this instance, assets do not include our buildings. They do not include any of our fixed assets or our equipment. And what John Paul was showing, our fund balance also does not include the OPEB or pension liability. Those show up on a whole different set of books. When we talk about overall fund balance, we're talking about how the governmental funds work. So we could be talking about how the general fund works, how the bond redemption fund works, how each of our individual funds work, but this is not assets versus liabilities in kind of the long-term sense. This is generally current assets minus current liabilities. It's not 100% true, but it's pretty close to accurate as to the types of assets the district has. So here we're talking about cash as the primary asset that the district has in the governmental funds. And we'll look at the financial statements overall here in a second. But when we look at those fund balances, we are just looking at the funds themselves as opposed to, I don't know how else I guess to say it, other than I'll show you in a moment and hope that makes a little bit more sense.
Hey, Aaron, I'm by no means an accounting person at all, but
Neither am I.
is that is that normal to not include your buildings and such, or is it truly putting it down to like liquid assets? I'm just trying to wrap my brain around that.
So I'm going to transfer it over to our actual audit because I do think that that's going to help this conversation. And of course, I got to remember the best way to find the one I'm looking for. There you go. Nope. Okay. I'm going to make this a little bit wider so it makes sense here. Okay, so when we look here at the basic financials of the district, this district has a statement of net position, which is what anyone who is a normal person would consider a balance sheet. And that is where we're going to see that's where we're going to see those assets that I talked about. When we talk about the governmental funds, then it's a little bit different as the type of piece that we're looking at. I think the way that Gatsby shows it is it says that statement of net position and statement of activities makes us more comparable to private industry. So when we look at, and here we're only going to be looking at this first column, the component units then would be the charter schools. Hopefully you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see the
Yes, Aaron.
financial statements? Okay.
Yep.
So you'll see here, even on this particular presentation of the balance sheet, we would always start with the amount that's most liquid to the amount that's the least liquid, or the amount that's most current versus the amount that is most, I would say, non-current. So here we would start with a normal balance sheet, your cash, your receivables, your inventory, other. Every financial statement has other. What is other? It's other. And then you would have capital assets not being depreciated. There are two types for the school district. The first one is land. Land does not depreciate, so would be the overall cost of our land from when it was first purchased. And the other thing that is not being depreciated is an asset that we're currently a building, you could say construction in process or construction in progress. It's just limited to CIP. And then everything else would be the capital assets net of accumulated depreciation. And when you look at those assets, we have $1 billion worth of assets, which is exactly what we would expect. But remember that the buildings are net of depreciation. So, the longer our buildings are, the more they've been depreciated. Here, then, I think Kelly is where there's also this huge variance is now all of a sudden we're saying that the district has, and we'll look down below at liabilities, that the district has a liability for pensions. No, we don't. It is not our liability, but GASB makes us put that on our financial statements. I would also say that the due within 1 year and the due in more than 1 year, the $341 million, that represents, in general, the outstanding debt of the district. When we then look at this net investment in capital assets, this is the phrase that pays on capital assets. So essentially, this is our fixed assets minus the amount that we owe on those fixed assets. And so we have our net investment is approximately $306 million. What you'll also see then is we have funds that are set aside specifically for Tabor and debt service and food service, and we'll come back to those when we talk about fund balance. But then you will see, as Jean Paul was mentioning, we have this huge negative number. In the private sector, in the private sector, if you had liabilities right here in excess of assets, there's a word for that, and it's not a very good word. That is an illiquid company. It's tending towards bankruptcy and is really upside down. And I think, as John Paul mentioned, this is not the form that we would take as to whether or not the school district is viable and continuing operations. So yes, we do have this sort of financial statements overall, again, that look more at the entire organization and makes us look more like private industry. Same thing with revenues and expenditures. And I can show you there's a different way of looking at this. So I'm actually going to move now back to I'm going to move to the notes because it shows it, not the notes, the MD&A. And what the MD&A basically shows is it shows, I want to get to this piece here. So we have what's called the government-wide financials and then the governmental fund financials. This is the one we were just looking at, Kelly. It's all assets and all liabilities, both financial and non-financial, both short-term and long-term.
Okay.
It would be all revenues, even if it relates to a future year way down the road. It treats, so in this case, back to your question about can a district afford certain things, when we actually build a building, for example, or we purchase what normally we would call a capital asset, in this column over here, it's actually an expenditure. But on this side over here, we would capitalize that asset. and then we would have that asset and depreciate it over a certain amount of time. Versus over here, we've actually used cash to build that building, and over on this side, it's actually called it an expenditure. So it's a huge difference. We've used current assets, cash, to build those buildings. And under this governmental fund structure, the governmental fund would say that's an expenditure.
Okay. I see.
So when another way to look at it here is under governmental activities, we then do get to see here's our current assets, here's our capitalized assets, here's our current liabilities, and here's our long-term liabilities. So if we flip this around to governmental funds, if we flip this around to governmental funds, we know that current assets is higher than current liabilities.
Gotcha. Okay. That helps.
And as James can attest, one of the things that the state takes a look at is our current ratio. And our current ratio basically says by how much or how many times do current assets exceed current liabilities? And then in this case, we have a very significantly positive current ratio. So the same thing would be with expenditures. You would see right in these areas, you'll see that we have no capital expenditures. Well, that cannot possibly be true. So when we look at the governmental fund financials, you'll actually see that we do have the current debt service payments and our facilities acquisition and expenditures that are on these statements. Those don't exist on the others because you don't have an expense for debt service the other way around. You're just reducing your debt.
Okay.
As opposed to, no, it's really a use of cash. And so we've got cash that goes out the door. And from a current aspect, we would just call that an expense. What I think is good here is this is a good reconciliation between what's the difference between fund balance on the governmental funds of 297 million versus net position of a negative $95 million. And this walks us through each of those components, which I think is very helpful. Add back the capital assets, net, add back the debt, add back the pension liability section here. And if you take all of those away from the $297 million fund balance, we would then say we have a negative net position of $95 million. At the same time, our current year for the audit year surplus would have been $43.6 million amongst all funds, but we have to take back out the capital outlay out of this because it isn't an expense. We have to add depreciation, which depreciation is a sort of phantom expense, right? It didn't cost us any cash. So we have to add that back. We then add back the repayments of the debt, which in the governmental funds we call an expenditure. And then we add back the expense, the incremental expense for pensions. And that's how we get to the difference between, oopsie daisy. That's how we get to the difference between the fund balances here versus the net position here. So overall, 99 and 44 100% of the time, the bond rating agencies want to know what is available in fund balance. they don't spend a lot of time on net position because they understand that we're not going to essentially sell those buildings or make them available for cash, and we're not responsible for the pension and OPEB liabilities. So they do concentrate more on the fund balance pieces. So mostly, Kelly, I just talk until people just want like, yeah, I'm done. I stop listening. And so that's what I try to do. So was that remotely helpful, Kelly?
Yeah, that helped. I just, like I said, it didn't seem normal, but I also, since you're a school district, so that actually did help a lot. Thank you so much, Aaron. Appreciate it.
So
Aaron, it'd be better if you were wearing a Broncos uniform.
no, 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 no,
No.
no. Final
Got
Four
it.
in volleyball is tonight.
Hey, Aaron, I do have a question for you on the fund
Yes.
balances. I think you mentioned this earlier, but I think there's kind of the Byzantine way of kind of how, mill levies and mills, work relative to funding from the state and everything. With the mill not passing, is there any implication to the way we read these financials from the mill not passing? Do you, may not show up yet now, but what should we expect to happen from that?
So I'm going to switch to a different page, and we're going to look at the budget comparison schedule of the fund balance. So had the mill passed, let's say this is the future budget year, right after we passed and we're utilizing those funds, we would expect this number here to be higher by $34 million, the amount of the levy. What you will then see is that this year we had an operating surplus of approximately $24.6 million. So the gap between the 34 and the 24.6, it's not huge, but it is significant, it is significant enough to have a difference. Where we then look is in these $478 million worth of expenditures, how many of those expenditures are really one time? And we would then have to start looking, which we do anyway, we do this every year, is we look at what are the one-time revenues that can be spent on one-time expenditures. The best representation of that was ESSER funds. All one-time money. If anyone spent that on salaries and benefits, the money went away. So it's very difficult to keep that salary and benefit growing. What I would say is that we would hope that school finance continues to grow. It won't grow as fast as probably, well, depending on what the governor and the General Assembly come out of with this next session. But I don't think overall, based on our current budget strategy for next year and what we're seeing, that what we won't do, Mike, is grow programs. If you looked at, all the things that we were looking at spending money on, one of those pieces were salary increases of a specific amount. Those won't happen. And then we also had an extension of the operating components of CTE. So the hope is that, but also remember those buildings aren't built yet.
Mhm.
So with the hope of placing the mill levy back on the ballot in the next 4 years, would by then we would have those new CTE buildings either built or in development, and then the district would be asking for funds to expand those programs. And, again, I think the voters have the opportunity to say no, but 4 years from now, obviously, we can't say what's going to happen. In the short term, Mike, I don't see a lot of reductions. I just don't see the expansion.
Got it. Okay. So basically, what I'm hearing you say is you guys aren't necessarily worried that there'll have to be major reductions in our current spending to accommodate the mill not passing.
Correct. And first we have this $24.6 million operating surplus that we currently have, and then we'll move into fund balances that we currently have as well that are not restricted, which I don't think is going to be really an cause us in the short term to have those issues. I
You
can't
know,
say
this may be a side detour that we don't want to get into at this point, but my recollection from when we looked at this stuff last year was, especially when we looked at some of the state funding and where some of the, I guess, districts that don't need to get as much state funding because they generate more of their own. I mean, remember DPS was surprisingly high to me. I mean, Boulder, not surprising, but I think one of the things we talked about was the amount of commercial real estate they have and how much that drives some of the, the taxes that are collected for those districts. Just along the I-25 corridor, obviously there's like a lot of like light industrial construction, and you got like the giant Amazon warehouses and a few others seem to be going in all the time. Are there projections or expectations that helps and drives a little bit more revenue for the school district, or have we already kind of factored that in?
good question. So for the school district, the answer is no, it doesn't drive any expansion in revenue. And the reason for that is we have fixed dollar mills, which means our mill passed, I think one of them, and Bobby can correct me, but I'm somewhat correct. It's one of them passed at $9.5 million. Well, that's all we're going to collect is $9.5 million. So regardless of our tax base and the growth of that tax base, it wouldn't change. And none of our mill levies all of our mill levies are fixed mill. One does grow by inflation, the others do not. So half of the mill grows by inflation, and then the others do not. And what I want to share with you quickly is the presentation that we gave at the board meeting, which kind of gives us when we set the mill levy. There we go. Open sesame. One of the things here that I think, Mike, that is important to see is that this line here, and I'm colorblind. I helped put this slide together, but I'm colorblind. So let's just go with the bottom line. You'll see the bottom line is actually what we've done. These are the flat, no growth. This is the year we passed an additional levy, but it's no growth until we pass another one. No growth, regardless of what happens to assessed valuations in the district. In fact, even if the assessed valuations were ever to go down, we would still collect the same amount of money. Then you'll see in the 2018 mill, the reason why this bluish purple line grows, this growth right here between 18 and 28 is inflation. Now, if you take what we originally passed, this is actually inflation adjusted. So what we originally started with, the difference between these two numbers is significant. The amount of actual buying power is this more purple line. We can't afford the way prices have increased because of the way we've set our mills. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And then when you look at net assessed valuation, this is much different. district, school district property area than say Boulder, as you mentioned. This and this is a per pupil look, but overall, as far as a per pupil look, we would be the lowest of the 15 metro areas, whereas Englewood with fewer students but substantially higher assessed valuations, and Boulder Valley and Denver the same. We're Then we see the MLOs per district. We're 14th out of 15th. And again, this is a per pupil. We can't raise the type of money that Boulder can on, 1 mil at Boulder raises a lot more money than 1 mil here. And our mills don't grow, theirs do. Theirs grow by the amount that their School Finance Act revenue grows, and they can levy to the maximum amount allowed by state law, and we cannot. So, but good question, and I do want to get what do I have left, Caroline? About 8 minutes.
8 minutes. Yep.
We can get there. So we do have categories of fund balance. There are two: those that are reserved and we can't touch, and those that or we can't touch without significant barriers, and then those that are unrestricted. Non-spendable, we can't spend it because we already spent it. That's inventory and prepaid items. So that's just kind of money. That's fund balance that's set aside because it's not an expense yet, but we've purchased those items. We've prepaid for them. When we talk about restricted, and Mike, and I know you had this specific question, Tabor and multi-year obligations comes directly out of the state constitution. Then nutrition comes from the USDA. If we have money that goes into the fund for nutrition, it cannot be spent on anything other than nutrition. We can't take money out of that account. We can't move it to the general fund. We can only spend it on allowable expenditures based on what the USDA allows. Then the next two are bond related. When we issue bonds, we are required by statute and by bond covenants to spend those proceeds on what we said we are going to spend them on. Again, we can't move them to the general fund and pay salaries and benefits with them. We can't move them to athletics and, pay our coaches more. Those things cannot happen. On the taxes that pay for the principal and interest of the bonds, that's the levy that was passed. That, again, we cannot utilize those revenues for anything other than paying the principal and interest of the bonds. We can never move those monies. And so those are really the overall restricted amounts. So regardless of whatever these amounts grow to or are lower to, they are restricted in their purpose. And this is sorry. So this is, and I say this is, sorry, that's typo. This is not what this is. This is board restricted or board set aside. And then these are resources subject to internally identifiable constraints. So, sorry about that. So when we don't have committed, because the only way to commit funds is by board resolution, and the only way to uncommit funds is by same board resolution. So it takes a lot to do that. But when we look at our assignments, and this is fairly significant for us right now, the assignments of those fund balances, those relate to pupil activities. So we have revenues that we've collected for pupil activities, we've said, and we've set aside an assigned fund balance that we won't spend that on anything else other than pupil activities, the money, the reason why we collected it. Athletics, either fees or gate revenue or advertisements, it will stay in benefit athletics. What we charge tuition for base, it stays in the base fund to keep paying for teachers or educators at base. Then we also might decide to set aside for specific contingencies, and that includes right now risk. So we set aside $5 million for risk. And let me explain why we would do that. Because we have seen in many districts across the state that their premiums have gone up 100%. And 4 or 5 years ago, they also went up 100%. So they have substantially grown. Anything that has happened in your personal life has happened to the district. Our auto insurance has gone up, our property insurance has gone up. And if we were to have any sort of loss, to your earlier point, Mike, if we had a loss, we would have to reduce general fund expenditures unless we had a reserve to pay for it. And that is why we have that reserve. Same thing with IT. We don't normally spend the same amount of funds on IT every year. So to keep it from going up and down and impacting the general fund, we keep a reserve. We do the same thing for instructional materials because again, we don't buy or adopt curriculum every year. So we want to protect against those ebbs and flows of those expenditures. And then we would say the whatever is left is unassigned. And the district has a board policy that unassigned fund balance can be no more than 8% and no less than 4% of revenue. And that is what we think about today. And then we take all of that, both board policy and things that have come from this, all come from or stem from GFOA. And we'll share more of this, and I'll print some of this and put it into the guidance. It used to say 2 months of expenditures, which would be somewhere around 16%. It doesn't say that anymore because 16% of expenditures at New York City or LA Unified is a very large amount. But a boiler in Ray costs the same amount as a boiler here. So fund balance at Ray and Yuma may need to be larger than the fund
Hey, Aaron.
balance that we have.
Hey, Aaron.
Yes.
I know we're going to run out of time here. I just want to make sure I capture my notes in the right places. I know we reviewed, with John Paul today. Is there a tab for 24.10? There's not, right? We don't put notes in the workbook on that one.
No, there is not a tab, Mike.
Okay, got it. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything there. So, okay.
What's 2410? Sorry.
That was I guess there's a policy for 2410, the annual audit kickoff that was on the agenda for today. I know we reviewed it with John Paul. I just didn't see a tab for it. So I wanted to make sure I didn't miss capturing notes somewhere that I needed to.
I'll make sure that we get that to you if it's something different.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And then these presentations are on the drive, and certainly we can talk about them as time permits going forward.
Thank you, Aaron. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.